Did you just hear those ads? Do you not want to? Because Crimelines is available ad-free on Supercast, Patreon, and Apple subscriptions. You will also get access to my other twice-monthly podcast, Beyond the Files. That's where I take cases that were covered on Forensic Files and tell you the rest of the story. Links to those platforms are in the show notes. It is time for the June Patreon birthday shoutouts. I want to send the warmest birthday greetings to Michaela, JB, Claudia, Anne-Marie, Jennifer, Jamie, Sarah, Trisha, and Missy. Thank you so much for your support on Patreon, and I hope your birthday month has been filled with celebrations, and I hope your next year is full of adventures and memories. So to my June Patreon birthdays, I want to say happy birthday. When Robert Cantor was killed, everyone knew who did it, or they thought they did. Pressure was put on the police to solve the case, but in spite of their best efforts, everything was just circumstantial. Would it ever be enough for a jury? I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello and welcome to Crimelines. As I have been doing rather frequently lately, I'm going to direct you down to my episode description box where you are going to find all sorts of things. There's a link to my sources, links to my social media, links to sponsors, links to Supercast and Patreon if you don't want to listen to those sponsors, and also links to events I'm doing, including the Berkshire Podcast Festival in October, and assuming there are still spots left, the link to come on the Chile and Argentina trip with me in late February 2025. There's just so much information down there, but I know as a podcast listener, I don't always think to check the description box when I'm listening to a podcast, so I just like to remind people it's there. There's so much information and you can just find it in one place rather than having to check my social media for things when I get around to posting. Anyone who follows me on social media knows my posting is hit or miss. And if you're on Instagram or Facebook, you know that I prefer just communicating in memes anyway. But let's go ahead and get into today's case. It's been on my list for a while, but I don't cover cases anymore that are pending trial, so I waited. Then I didn't get back to this until after a Dateline episode came out. And then I didn't want to just hop on the Dateline train. I mean, I'm in podcast groups. I see the comments out there about podcasts that just regurgitate the latest Dateline episode. And I don't mean a recap commentary show like Date with Dateline, but more shows formatted like mine, where it sounds like these are all original ideas from my head, but I really used a number of sources. If I just saw an episode, though, on Dateline or 2020, or I watched a documentary on it, I'm way too likely to then synthesize those thoughts and then think they're my own and present them that way. So I like to put a little bit of space between me and the first time I hear about a case. Obviously, I go back and make sure I get information from those sources, but I'm doing the best I can not to overly rely on them. And with that said, Dateline was obviously a source, which is one reason I'm mentioning it. But I also want to mention another source that I got a lot of the information from the trial from, and that is The Record. And as you can see, if you click on my sources in my show notes, journalist Peter Sampson wrote most of the articles I used. This case starts with Robert Cantor. Rob was a software engineer with Verizon, and he lived in Teaneck, New Jersey, which is just over the George Washington Bridge from Manhattan. He and his wife, Susan, raised 2 daughters together, put them through college, and then realized they had grown apart. They tried marriage counseling to try to build a bridge back to each other, but it just wasn't working. After 27 years of marriage, they separated. They owned their house together for about 20 years, and neither of them were fully prepared to just move out, so they separated within the house. Rob moved down to the basement area where they had a spare bedroom and some extra space, and Susan stayed upstairs. Their split really came as a surprise to those who knew them. They just didn't see it coming. There was no big blow-up, no signs from the outside that they weren't getting along, no cheating scandal or anything like that. They just decided they would both be happier outside of the marriage. And neither one of them initiated the separation. They decided to do it together, and because of that, they remained on good terms. In September of 2009, which was after their separation, but while they were still sharing the house together as roommates, 57-year-old Rob went to a lecture at a museum in New York City. He was highly intelligent, and he enjoyed learning new things, so this was the sort of activity he liked to do. At the wine and cheese reception after the lecture, he noticed there was a woman who was wearing a shirt that said Paris Marathon on it. Another of Rob's interests was running, and he had done marathons before, so he approached the woman and struck up a conversation. Her name was Sophie, and she was a married mother of 3 who lived in Manhattan. She was originally from France, and she and Rob learned that they had a lot in common, like running marathons and attending scientific lectures for fun. I don't know that the intersection of people that share those interests is that large, so they were both intrigued and exchanged email addresses so they could keep in contact. Over the next few months of talking, Rob developed feelings for Sophie that he eventually confessed. But Sophie told him she was married and she was not looking for anything else. And it was true that she was married and not looking, but that's not to say she was happily married. Sophie was married to Sway Kam Tung, who went by Tony. He was born in Hong Kong, and the two met in New York City while Sophie was a graduate student. They dated for a short time before they drifted apart, and then a couple years later, they bumped into each other at a farmer's market and began a more serious relationship. In 2001, they had a daughter together, and then another daughter in 2003. They married in 2005, and then they had one more child together, yet another daughter, in 2006. With 3 young children, I think it's easy to see that childcare would be expensive, and childcare for multiple small children in New York City is something else altogether. Since Sophie made more money, it made sense for her to stay in her job, working in corporate finance at the executive level, while Tony primarily stayed home with the girls. As their youngest got to be preschool age, Tony decided he wanted to run his own business. He opened a computer repair shop in Manhattan, but not just one he ran out of his apartment or made house calls with. That financially may have been the better option, but Tony decided to open a brick and mortar. Having a physical storefront gave him a place to work, but it also meant overhead in New York City, and that overhead cost more than the business was taking in. So the couple was living in a small apartment with 3 kids while Sophie worked full-time, in part to support Tony's fledgling business. That is something that can cause stress on a relationship if everyone isn't on the same page. And Tony and Sophie were not on the same page. Sophie saw as the money was leaving their bank account and the deficit Tony's business was running. But anytime she tried to talk to Tony about cutting back so that they could save more, he would shut her down. And it was even worse when Sophie started to feel incredibly burned out. She was working a high-pressure corporate job, and at home, she was still doing a lot of the work of running the household. In hopes of finding some balance, Sophie suggested to Tony that she cut back her work hours to part-time, at least temporarily. It would obviously mean a cut in the budget, so Tony said no. They couldn't afford for her to go part-time while he was still trying to get his business off the ground. Sophie started feeling like this wasn't a partnership. Tony saw her more like property. She was there to take care of the kids' schedules and clean the house, while also bringing in money so that he could do what he wanted and pursue his dreams, only they were at her expense. The resentment grew, particularly since Tony just would not compromise. Eventually, several weeks after meeting Rob, Sophie told Tony that she didn't think their marriage was working out. Things were to the point that it was unfixable. During their discussion about separating, Tony asked her if she would still be there if they didn't have kids, and she said no. She had only tried to stay as long as she did because of the children. At that point in time, when this conversation happened, she and Rob were still talking as friends, though she knew he had a crush on her. When Sophie finally admitted to Tony, and probably to herself, that the marriage was over, she was more open to seeing where things went with Rob. Sophie still wanted to keep things with Tony as peaceful as possible since they were still living together, and Tony hadn't quite accepted that their marriage was heading towards divorce. So to keep her budding relationship with Rob a secret, she set up an email account that Tony didn't know about so that she could talk to Rob. That sounds to me like she suspected Tony would, at the very least, snoop in on her emails. In early 2010, Sophie started making plans to move out of the apartment, and shortly before she did move out, her and Rob's relationship became physically intimate for the first time over Valentine's weekend. Then on Valentine's Day, Tony gave Sophie a card. This surprised her because in the 10 years they were together, Tony had never given her a Valentine's Day card. This romantic gesture, as she was getting closer to moving out, seemed like maybe a last-ditch attempt on Tony's part to woo her back. But then Sophie read the card. She knew something was up because the things he wrote in that card closely mimicked things she had written in an email to Rob. A few days after this, Rob told Sophie that he had gotten anonymous emails telling him to stay away from Sophie. One was even threatening to shoot him if he didn't leave her alone. He told Sophie that he suspected they came from Tony, and maybe he had gone through her laptop and found the emails. Sophie decided to check on this in two ways. One, she checked her laptop, and two, she checked Tony's computer. On Tony's computer, in his email, she found messages that he had sent to a friend. One of them said that Sophie was in love with another man and that other man was married. A few days after sending that one, he sent the friend a new one that said, quote, "They finally had sex. It was great for her. I've written a Valentine's Day card for her." End quote. So at that point, Sophie knew he was reading her emails, and she soon found out that he more than snooped on her laptop. Someone had installed a spyware program in February of 2010, shortly before Valentine's Day, that logged everything she typed. The program was registered to a user named Lord168Con, which Sophie knew was Tony because he used a similar name for other online accounts, including their bank. Sophie did not wait to confront Tony about this, telling him as soon as he got home that night that she knew that he knew about her and Rob. Tony admitted he knew, but he denied it was because of spyware. He claimed he got copies of 4 months of emails between her and Rob delivered to his computer shop via a FedEx package. He said he didn't know who sent it or why, but there had to be a reason, and Tony speculated it might be mob-related. Tony then lectured Sophie on the type of man Rob was, an older man who picked up bored housewives. He really couldn't figure out why Sophie was interested in a man who was 18, 19 years older than her, but Tony was sure that she was not the first woman Rob had seduced like that. As Tony went on, Sophie started wondering herself what kind of man was Rob. She didn't really know him that well. She had only met him about 5 months before. So maybe Tony was right. Tony then told Sophie not to contact Rob again. Sophie started protesting, saying she had to at least talk to him one more time to break things off. But Tony got agitated at that suggestion. He told her that he wasn't supposed to tell her anything about what he knew, and if that got out, he would be in big trouble. Tony then wanted to know where Sophie and Rob were when they first slept together, and Sophie said it was in a basement bedroom in his house in Teaneck, New Jersey. Of course, that was Rob's bedroom at the time since Susan was still living upstairs, but Tony got, according to Sophie, pretty upset that she had slept with one, an older man, and two, in a basement bedroom. The conversation that night ended with Sophie agreeing not to see Rob again. Tony had her mostly convinced that there was something nefarious going on around Rob and that this situation might actually be dangerous. Tony had left the conversation having told Sophie never to contact Rob again, but she did reach out to him the next day to break up with him. She just didn't feel right ghosting him, and she later said that Rob sounded heartbroken. He asked Sophie if she still loved him, and she said, unfortunately, yes. That night, Sophie told Tony that she talked to Rob and broke things off, but instead of being glad the relationship was over, Tony blew up at her, saying that he told her not to do that and now his life was in danger. Sophie had essentially killed him. Tony once again started talking about the unknown sender of the email, and he half started a story about a black limo, but cut it off saying that he couldn't tell her more or she would be in danger. He suggested she take their kids back to France to visit family for a bit, and he said he was going to take $2,000 out of their bank account to buy a gun that he needed for their protection. On February 18th, 2010, there was a $2,000 withdrawal from their bank, and Sophie said Tony then came home with a paper bag. He opened it and showed her the gun he bought. Sophie's response at this point was that if Tony was in so much danger, shouldn't he go to the police? Tony was not going to do that, but then said he wanted to take $5,000 out of their bank account to buy protection from a Chinatown gang. And at this point, Sophie put her foot down and said no. When the heightened emotions that Tony had stirred up subsided, Sophie knew Tony's version of what happened and the risk from Rob was ridiculous. And it certainly didn't change anything about their failing marriage. So on March 6th, 2010, Sophie and her 3 daughters moved into a new apartment. And then, after about a month, Sophie and Rob's relationship started up again. Tony wasn't ready to let go entirely, and he asked Sophie if she would see a marriage counselor with him. For Sophie, there was no going back, so she talked to the therapist and was clear on her goals for their sessions. She needed help getting Tony to see that the relationship was over, and she wanted to make their split and co-parenting situation as amicable and peaceful as possible. Then one day, not long after Sophie moved out, Tony drove out to Rob's house and knocked on the door. Rob was surprised to see him, but invited him in anyway. Then over the next 3 hours, the two talked, with Tony saying he just wanted to get to know the man in Sophie's life. It didn't surprise Rob's friends that he would have invited Tony in and even made him coffee. Rob was like that. He was friendly and he was a peacemaker, so this was in his nature. But it doesn't mean they thought it was the right move. When one of Rob's friends heard about this, he asked Rob what was he thinking letting Tony in his house, and Rob said he felt sorry for him. His marriage was breaking up while his kids were still young, and everything was falling apart on him. If Rob sitting down and hearing him out was what he needed, Rob was willing to do that. Tony did ask Rob not to see Sophie again during this conversation, and Rob said he couldn't give him an answer on that. The visit wasn't overtly hostile, but there were 2 things towards the end that definitely felt off. They left Rob a little rattled. One was that Tony wanted to see the bedroom where Rob and Sophie first slept together. Rob would probably have resisted this more if Tony hadn't already been at his house for hours, making Rob late to work. He basically wanted to get Tony to finally leave, so he went ahead and showed him the basement bedroom. The other thing Tony did was take a picture of Rob off of the fridge and left with it. Apparently, there was some talk between Rob and his friends about going to the police, but really, what was there to say? Tony came over, which was weird, and he wanted to see where his wife slept with another man, which was even weirder, but it didn't seem actionable. There were the anonymous emails that kept showing up, saying things like, "I saw you with Sophie at such and such place." Susan, Rob's estranged wife, even got a Facebook message telling her that Rob was seeing a younger woman. Now, that wasn't news to Susan. She and Rob were still on good terms, and she knew he was seeing someone. When she showed the message to Rob, he told her it was probably coming from Tony. On the whole, the emails weren't overtly threatening, so Rob let them go. And then Tony came by Rob's house for a second time. This was about a month after his first visit, and Rob agreed to talk to him again, but this was not going to be another 3-hour marathon conversation. It was much shorter. And then, when Tony came by for a third time, Rob said he was on his way to work, and though he chatted out on the patio for a bit, he definitely did not sit down and have a long conversation again. At that point, whatever answers Tony was looking for, it was clear he was not going to get them through more small talk.
If you love chilling mysteries, unsolved cases, and a touch of mom-style humor, Moms and Mysteries is the podcast you've been searching for. Hey guys, I'm Mandy.
And I'm Melissa. Join us every Tuesday for Moms and Mysteries, your gateway to gripping, well-researched true crime stories. Each week, we deep dive into a variety of mind-boggling cases as we shed light on everything from heists to whodunits. We're your go-to podcast for mysteries with a motherly touch. Subscribe now to Moms and Mysteries wherever you get your podcasts.
For the remainder of 2010, Sophie and Tony were living apart. Rob's wife, Susan, eventually moved out of their home as well, and Sophie and Rob kept seeing each other. When Sophie moved out in March of 2010, she couldn't just file for divorce unless she wanted to assign fault, like adultery or cruel and inhumane treatment. If the cause for the divorce was abandonment, the separation had to be for a year. New York did not allow for no-fault divorces until August of 2010. So in early 2011, Sophie met with a divorce attorney to finally get the ball rolling. Sophie told them that the separation had been mostly amicable, with the exception of Tony not being too pleased that she was already seeing someone else. She had also paid Tony $1,500 a month for a period of time to give him a bit of a buffer to get financially stable, and he was pretty angry when she stopped paying. But according to what her divorce attorney said, she didn't seem to think the divorce would be terribly contentious. Sophie didn't intend on asking for anything in the divorce, aside from not being married to Tony anymore. She could afford the children's expenses, which she had been paying the entire time anyway, so she didn't want child support or anything like that. Tony could keep the apartment, and they would just continue the custody schedule that allowed for ample parenting time for both of them. The attorney sent a letter to Tony in late January 2011, letting him know that the firm was representing Sophie in the divorce. The hope was for an uncontested divorce where they just hammered everything out between them and brought it to the judge. But Tony never replied to that letter, so Sophie filed for divorce in mid-February. Tony was served on March 3rd. Tony said he planned to counterfile divorce papers claiming adultery as the reason, and putting Rob and Sophie both on the stand. It's hard to say if that would have given him much of a leg up in the divorce proceedings, since Sophie wasn't asking for child support or alimony or property or anything like that. And it seemed all he would get from this was the opportunity to embarrass them in court. 3 days after Tony was served papers, Sophie went to the art museum with Rob, 2 of his friends, and one of Tony and Sophie's daughters. Afterwards, Sophie left to go home with her daughter while Rob went out to dinner with his friends, and he dropped one of them off at home. He called the other around 8 p.m. to warn him to drive carefully because it was pretty stormy out. Around 11:30 that night, Rob's neighbor Scott was watching TV when he heard a loud thud. It was loud enough to catch his attention, but because it was stormy outside, he thought the wind may have blown something onto the side of the house. Maybe a branch or something like that. He listened for a minute, heard nothing else, and went back to watching TV. About a half an hour, 45 minutes later, Scott heard someone banging on his door. It was a man he had never met before, alerting him to a fire next door at Rob Cantor's house. The man, Henry, had been driving through the neighborhood earlier that day on his way to a christening when he got a flat tire. So that he wasn't late to church, he just parked his truck and got a ride, and then after the day's festivities, his girlfriend drove him back out to his truck so he could change the tire and head home. He had been putting his tools in the back of his truck when he saw a haze of smoke about half a block away. Henry had been a volunteer fireman, so he decided he was going to go check it out. He went up to the corner, saw the orange glow of the flames, and then ran back to tell his girlfriend to call 911. He then ran towards the fire. And the 911 call was logged at 12:13 a.m. on March 7th, 2011. Henry saw that the flames were coming from the basement of Rob's house, so he first banged on the door to alert anyone inside that there was a fire. No one answered, so he went over to Scott's door. The two tried to beat back the flames with a hose, but the fire was just too strong. Scott also tried calling Rob, but he got no answer, and he assumed that meant, thankfully, that Rob wasn't home. It took a few hours to get the fire under control so that they could enter the house. In the basement bedroom, which appeared to be the origin of the fire, they found a burned-out mattress and what looked like human remains. 59-year-old Rob Cantor had been at home, and he had not survived the fire. Initially, the firefighters did not know what they were looking at. They were told Rob was a healthy man, and usually healthy people who die in a fire are found near a door or a window trying to escape. They're not usually found on the bed near the origin of the fire, unless it was something like he passed out with a cigarette. So the arson investigator came out to the scene to take a look, and he immediately suspected foul play. The investigators asked for a rush on Rob's autopsy so they could determine if they were pursuing a homicide case, and that's when they found out that it was definitely murder. Rob was already dead at the time the fire started, having been shot in the back of the head. With this information, the investigators went back out to Rob's house, and using a metal detector, they found a spent .380 shell beneath the charred remains of the box spring. And because Rob's body had protected the comforter he was lying on from damage, they were able to test it, and they found that there was an accelerant used, ethanol. Robbery was quickly ruled out as a motive, as Rob's wallet was on the kitchen table untouched, as were his cell phone and keys and all of his other valuables in plain sight. But investigators learned that Rob was in the process of getting a divorce, having separated from his wife a couple of years before that. A dragging on divorce is a red flag, so they sat down to talk to Rob's estranged wife, Susan, to see what she knew. Susan was absolutely devastated by Rob's death, not just her own grief, but the grief of what her daughters were going through, losing their father like this, and that emotion was obvious to the investigators. Susan talked openly about her marriage to Rob, and she said that the separation and divorce were not contentious. The only reason things were taking so long was that they had been trying to separate out 27 years worth of joint finances. Neither one of them was in a particular rush to finalize things, so it was just taking time, particularly as they tried to decide whether they were going to sell the family home, or was Rob going to stay there and maybe buy her out? Susan was asked for an alibi, and like most people late on a Sunday night, she was at home. And since she lived alone, she didn't have any witnesses, but she had talked to a friend on the phone at some point, which did confirm she was home for at least part of the night. In talking to Susan and other friends of Rob's, the investigators learned that he had been dating Sophie, and that her estranged husband, Tony, had been acting strangely, showing up at Rob's house and sending those anonymous emails, though there didn't seem to have been any recent contact. Still, it seemed worth following up on because Rob was a guy who went through his life without conflict with pretty much anyone. The only recent exception to that was Tony Tong. So Tony was interviewed within about 24 hours of the fire at a New York City police station. The interview was recorded, but it's only audio since the station they met at didn't have their interview rooms set up for any type of recording. They had to rely on a pocket-sized digital recorder to get anything recorded from the interview. At the top, the police told a little lie and said they were talking to Tony because Rob had been assaulted, and they were looking at people who might have a motive. The reason to do this is the hope that the person, if they're guilty, would slip up and mention that the person was dead or something else related to the murder when they shouldn't know that a murder had occurred. The investigators asked Tony how he knew Rob, and he admitted that he knew that Sophie had cheated on him with Rob, but he claimed he had come to terms with the situation. He was asked for his alibi for Sunday, March 6th, which was just the day before this interview, and Tony said he spent the day with his youngest daughter, who was about 5 years old at the time. Then, around 8 p.m., he drove her back to Sophie's apartment and stayed for around 20 minutes to spend time with all 3 of his girls. While there, his 8-year-old mentioned that she had gone to the museum with Sophie that day, and she met someone named Rob, who was Mommy's friend. This was the first time any of the girls had met Rob in the year since Sophie had moved out, but Tony told the investigators he wasn't upset about it because it had been a year and it was inevitable. But the detectives weren't so sure Tony was as cool with this as he said. The timing definitely seemed suspect. The murder occurred 1 year to the day after Sophie and the girls moved out. It was 3 days after Tony was served with divorce papers, and it was the same day Rob had met one of Tony's kids for the first time. It seemed like there could have been a lot of emotions cropping up in early March for Tony Tongue. The police asked Tony if he owned a gun, and he said that he used to, but he turned it over to the police 10 years before that, when his first daughter was born. Sophie didn't want a firearm in the house. At this point, the police had already spoken to Sophie, and they knew that he had that other gun, the one he bought right after finding out Sophie was having an affair with Rob. Tony admitted that he had that gun at one point, but it wasn't his, it belonged to a friend, and he only had it for a few days before he gave it back. Tony then gave his alibi for the night of the fire. He said that after he left Sophie's apartment building, he went home and hung out alone all night. He left at one point around 1 a.m. to go buy beer at the corner store, but other than that, he was home in Manhattan. He said he spent some time on his computer, he checked emails, he did dishes, and he watched an Indiana Jones movie marathon that was on TV. The detectives tried to trip him up on this, asking him what time was he in New Jersey, and he said, "Why would I be in Jersey?" They said they believed he went over there to confront Rob because his wife was divorcing him, taking her income that paid the bills, and surely that stress had gotten to him. He was acting out of emotion. They were basically trying to give Tony a bit of an out here. The whole, we understand, no one would blame you if you did crack, that kind of stuff. But Tony didn't fall for it. He said he did not go to New Jersey that night. And the investigators told him they're sure there was some record that would prove he did, whether it was an electronic toll pass or a cell phone tower or a camera. Something would put him in New Jersey. Towards the end of the interview, they asked Tony if he would consent to a forensic computer search, not to look for personal information, but just to look at his computer usage. If he was home doing housework and watching TV while playing around on the computer, they would see that. Tony said he would have to speak to an attorney before he agreed to any search. They then asked for consent to search his car, saying that if he didn't do anything, they wouldn't find any evidence. And again, Tony said he was going to have to talk to an attorney about it. The detectives then dialed up the pressure. They told him they could tell he was lying and that something had happened. They knew Tony was sorry about it, but Rob pushed him over the edge by spending the day with his daughter. They kept pushing, and when they would say things like, "What if the cell phone records put you in New Jersey?" Tony wouldn't say, "No, they wouldn't." He would say things like, "Records don't lie," and he wouldn't be able to argue against them. He gave similar answers when they said, what if they saw him crossing the George Washington Bridge, which is the fastest way to get from the Upper East Side to Teaneck? It wasn't a flat-out denial, but more like, you shouldn't see anything like that. After about 3 hours of questioning, Tony asked for a lawyer and the interview ended. The detectives then set out to look at all the ways they could prove Tony had gone to New Jersey. They checked to see if Tony had an easy pass toll thing, but he didn't, so there would be no record there. They then checked the toll booths coming back into Manhattan and didn't see him. They didn't check the toll going into New Jersey on the bridge because there isn't one, which is a bit of a joke. They can't charge a toll because who would pay to go to New Jersey? Anyway, Tony's cell phone hadn't pinged off any of the towers in New Jersey. Neither he nor his car were seen on the cameras through Manhattan or on the George Washington Bridge. And New York is not just a major city covered in cameras. Like most major cities, Manhattan is an island. So there aren't exactly back roads Tony could have taken to avoid detection. You have the George Washington Bridge, the Lincoln Tunnel, and the Holland Tunnel, and all three have cameras. They checked taxi records and public transportation and also came up empty. And no, he did not swim across the Hudson River. All they could find about Tony's car was that his license plate was logged by one of the automated license plate readers at 1:31 a.m., which is an hour and a half after the 911 call. The car was parked in front of a high school near Tony's apartment, and there were security cameras on some of the buildings. So they pulled the footage they had, hoping to see if Tony's car moved or not. It didn't move, but that's not to say the footage fully backed up Tony's alibi. The camera showed that Tony parked his car around 10:10 p.m., meaning it took him over an hour and a half to go from Sophie's apartment to his, which is really just a 20 to 30 minute drive depending on the traffic. And being that this was a Sunday night, it would have been on the shorter side. Tony had not mentioned to the police that he stopped anywhere on his way home. To get from Sophie's apartment to Rob's house and then back to Tony's apartment would have taken about an hour, but one, they couldn't find his car going across the bridge, and two, this does not fit the timeline. If the fire started around 9, which is when Tony could have gotten there between being at Sophie's apartment and his apartment, Rob's house would have been rubble by the time the fire was first spotted around midnight. It still seems to be a mystery regarding where Tony was during that hour and a half. So again, the footage showed him parking around 10:10, and then he walked in the direction of his apartment. 20 minutes later, Tony came back into view after leaving his apartment, and he was carrying a large bag. He then sat in his car for a while before he got out, now holding 2 bags. Around 10:46, he disappeared from the view of the cameras, but he was not walking in the direction of his apartment. Tony did not mention that he left his apartment at all in this time frame. He insisted he was inside doing dishes. In fact, he claimed he was doing dishes for an hour and a half to 2 hours. Tony was not seen again until between 1 and 2 a.m. when he went to the corner store to buy the beer, which then leaves him with no alibi from 10:46 p.m. until 1:11 a.m. And I say 1:11 because of what they found on Tony's computer. Tony had not consented to any searches, so they got warrants. From what they could find on Tony's computer from the night of the murder, he stopped using it at 9:48 p.m., and activity began again around 3.5 hours later at 1:11 a.m. Then around 2:45 a.m., he launched a program on the computer that deleted a large amount of data, 2 gigabytes. The program ran for the next 5 hours. This wasn't a program that just cleared up space on Tony's computer. It was one of those programs that cleared the data and then wrote over it, which made it very difficult for the forensic computer experts to recover anything. And they tried. They sent it everywhere they could, trying to extract the data, but all they could recover was a folder of emails between Rob and Sophie, which they already knew he had. Another search was executed on Tony's computer store, and they found clues that Tony may not have been as over Sophie and Rob as he said. They found notes with Rob's wife Susan's information, Rob's information, emails between Rob and Sophie, directions from Rob's house to Sophie's new apartment, a background report on Rob, and a cell phone bill from Sophie that had all the calls to Rob circled. The dates on these documents don't appear to have been recent. They were months old, but Tony was still holding on to them. Viewing this as generously as possible to Tony, maybe he was saving these things to use them in the divorce. I'm not sure why he had to hang on to a map to Rob's house or information on Susan, but maybe he was keeping everything just in case.
There's a place in the Blue Ridge Mountains where a designated American viticultural area produces wines as unforgettable as the views. To learn more about the crest of the Blue Ridge wine country, click this banner and find your mountain moments in Hendersonville, North Carolina.
In addition to searching the computer in the computer store, they also searched Tony's apartment. And this is where his "I did dishes for 2 hours" story completely falls apart. Now, the doing dishes story sounded strange to me even before I saw pictures of his kitchen. 2 hours is a long time to be doing dishes, and I say that as someone with 6 children. How many dishes did this man have? But then I saw the photos of the kitchen, which didn't look like it had been cleaned for 2 hours just a couple days before. It didn't look like it had been cleaned in some time. This was just not the kind of guy who cleans for 2 hours on a Sunday night. So why did Tony insist on this doing dishes story? He mentioned it multiple times, and even how long it took him. To me, and I'm sure to the investigators, it looked like he was coming up with a reason why he had no phone or computer usage during the time he was in New Jersey killing Rob. When Tony returned, he made the beer run to create a bit of an alibi, and then he set his computer to erase all of the evidence of what he had done and his motive behind it. That was at least the theory the investigators came up with. What they didn't have was proof, particularly proof he ever left Manhattan that night. They believed that Tony must have had help getting off the island, and the investigation showed that 2 days after the murder, Tony got a phone line in a fake name, and then he used it for 2 months, primarily to call his brother. Why would Tony need to call his brother on a phone line that the police didn't know about? Maybe he worried they had tapped his usual line. But again, I need to repeat that they did not find evidence that anyone, including Tony's brother, drove him anywhere that night. They only know that he walked away from his apartment at around 10:40, and then there is no confirmation he was back home until 1:11. But Tony was not the only lead they had to pursue. It turned out Rob Cantor wasn't the only person in Teaneck, New Jersey who had been murdered and the house set on fire. Teaneck has a population of 40,000, and this other fire happened less than a year before. Joan Davis was a 74-year-old woman who was found dead in her home on August 17, 2010. She had been beaten and stabbed, and her house was then set on fire. According to the New York Times and most other publications, Joan was a government gadfly. And what a word that is. You would have thought these articles were written in 1934. A gadfly is a person who criticizes in a bit of an annoying way. She was the lady who went to every city council meeting, every park board meeting, pretty much everything to keep everyone on their toes. Members of the public were given 5 minutes to voice their opinions on these issues, and she used every second of those 5 minutes on every issue. But Joan wasn't rude or abusive. She just had strong feelings on certain issues. She cared a lot about the environment. She cared that the township was treating their employees well, and she wanted to cut wasteful spending. There's another word the New York Times uses to describe Joan that I think fits her well, and that is harmless. She wrote letters and she voiced her opinions. It was kind of a hobby for her. and there are worse hobbies to have. She was so harmless, in fact, that a city council member was the one who would give her rides to these meetings. The police were looking deep into any grudges people might have held against Joan, but they were having trouble finding anyone who knew much about her at all. Joan had lived in her house for 20 years and rarely shared much, if anything, about her life. And then 7 months after Joan's murder, Robert Cantor was murdered and his house was torched. And it seemed like quite the coincidence for a town that didn't often have homicides. And if we look out a little more broadly, not just Teaneck, but the surrounding area, there was yet another similar death. 69-year-old Dolores Aliats was found dead in her home after firefighters responded to the reports of a fire. Like Joan, she had been beaten and stabbed before her house was lit on fire. To bring more awareness to these cases, I did a search to see if there were any podcasts that covered it, and both Joan and Dolores' unsolved cases are covered by my friends at the Navigating Advocacy podcast. They covered it back in 2022 if you want to go have a listen. But right now, as I'm recording this, I'm talking with them about doing a bonus episode here on Crimelines for everyone that would cover these cases and bring more awareness to them. But how this relates to the case we're covering today is what are the odds that 3 murders covered up by fires happened in the same county within 11 months. The cold case investigators today are linking Dolores and Joan's cases, not 100%, but they are so similar. They were older women at home alone, both had blunt force trauma to the head and stab wounds. But they didn't feel back in 2011 or today that Robert Cantor's case fit into this. He was a man, he was 10 to 15 years younger than the other victims, and he was shot rather than stabbed. But most of all, they had a solid suspect, they thought, in Tony Tung. And Tony didn't have a motive to kill the other people, only Rob. The investigators were so sure that Tony was the prime suspect that when Sophie took out a restraining order on Tony after the murder, they spoke to the judge on her behalf to keep the temporary order in place. Sophie believed Tony had killed Rob, and she wasn't sure that she or the children were safe. And Rob's friends also thought Tony made a good suspect and wondered why the police weren't acting. To them, it looked like they were leaving the most obvious stone unturned. They held protests, they hired a PI who had worked the West Memphis 3 case, and they even asked the state to come in and take a look. The state did do that. They talked to the Bergen County prosecutor and then told the public that the investigators were doing all that they could. The evidence the investigators found had been held back, but also the evidence they didn't find. And by that, I mean any direct evidence at all. Fingerprints and DNA would be too much to ask for, but what about proof Tony left Manhattan that night? Or the murder weapon? Or evidence Tony ever had that type of gun? They had none of that until April of 2012, when they got one more piece to the puzzle. While conducting their investigation into Tony, they made contact with a friend of his named Key who lived in Texas. He told the police that he had gotten a call from Tony in November of 2010, 4 months before the murder. And he and Tony talked about Tony possibly leaving New York to move to Texas to get back on his feet. Key thought it was a good idea since it's a lot more affordable to live in Texas than New York City, but Tony was hesitant to be that far away from his children. At some point in the conversation, the talk turned to guns, and Tony asked Key if he could get him a magazine for a handgun, a Walther PPK. This gun would shoot the same type of bullet as the casing found in Rob's basement. Key made a comment to Tony that the gun should have come with a magazine, and Tony said he was looking for a spare. Key worked for the government in the post-inspection service and eventually told Tony he wasn't going to go looking for gun parts for him. It just wasn't something he was going to get involved in. This was the last piece the state felt they needed to take this circumstantial case to trial. They now had a witness who had knowledge of Tony owning a gun that would match the murder weapon. Though Key never got a magazine for Tony, it didn't really matter. Tony could have already had one like he said, he could have gotten one elsewhere, or he could have shot the gun without it. Only one bullet was fired, and he could have just loaded it into the chamber. So on Friday, May 4th, 2012, 14 months after the murder of Rob Cantor, 43-year-old Swaycom Tony Tung was arrested. And he was charged with several things: first-degree murder and felony murder, second-degree aggravated arson, armed burglary, desecration of human remains, possession of a handgun for an unlawful purpose, hindering apprehension, stalking, and tampering with evidence. Tony was arrested near his home in New York City, and he was held on a $3 million bond while he awaited extradition across the Hudson River to New Jersey. At the time of his arrest, the police said to the media that they believed more arrests may be coming. To me, they were saying that they believed Tony had an accomplice, maybe the person who got him the gun, maybe the person who drove him to New Jersey that night. But those arrests never came, and Tony stood trial alone for this crime. When it did finally go to trial, Tony spent 3.5 years in pretrial detention, during which time Sophie divorced him and left the U.S. with the kids. The trial was held in November and December of 2015, and like I said, this case was circumstantial. There were no smoking guns found between the arrest and the trial, and what we've gone over already is pretty much all of the evidence they had. The state told the jury that Tony had been angry with Rob over the breakdown of his marriage. He knew there was no going back when Sophie filed for a divorce, but what really enraged him, the final straw, was learning, about 4 hours before the murder, that Rob had been around his young daughter. The defense basically said, if you can't prove Tony was in New Jersey that night, how can you prove he killed Rob? Between toll records, taxi and bus records, cell phone pings, security cameras, the NYPD license plate recognition cameras, they never found the vehicle that got Tony from his Upper East Side apartment to Teaneck and back. What they did have, according to the defense, was anti-evidence, meaning they had a camera on Tony's car proving it was parked where he said it was all night. Of course, the state used that same camera footage to prove that Tony had lied to the police and had left his apartment that night other than for that beer run. Maybe they didn't see where he went, but it was clear he wasn't walking back in the direction of his building. And this is how circumstantial cases go. The state puts their interpretation on it, and the defense twists it back around. Like the state saying Tony was obsessed with Rob and Sophie's relationship to the point he went to Rob's house 3 times. But the defense said those 3 visits actually showed Tony wasn't that angry. 3 visits and no one raised their voices or shoved each other or anything. If Tony would have done anything, wouldn't it have been in the aftermath of learning about the affair, not a year later? The defense said there were other suspects that the police didn't look into, like a contractor who had a key to the house, plus the contractor's employees. There was also a neighbor who said he saw a strange man in the neighborhood that night. He was wearing a red cap, and more importantly for this case, the man was white, not Chinese. And of course, there were Sophie and Susan, the 2 women in Rob's life who might have a motive. The defense didn't name them as likely suspects, but definitely used them as examples of the police department's tunnel vision in not pursuing them. The trial lasted 2 months, which is a long time considering that there wasn't much by way of forensic or scientific testimony. It was really just the state building the case by presenting all of the circumstances a piece at a time. The jury took the case and deliberated for 3 full days, and then partway through day 4, they were back with a verdict. Rob's family had worried in those days the jury was deliberating that they were going to not come to a consensus and it would be a mistrial. But then when there was a verdict, they were terrified it would be an acquittal. They could see the issues with a 100% circumstantial case, but they also 100% believed Tony was guilty. The jury came back with guilty verdicts on 8 of the charges, including one of the murder counts. They found Tony not guilty of felony murder and burglary. Tony Tung was then sentenced to life in prison without parole for 68 years, and at 52 years old, he would die before that day came. After trial, Tony did 2 media interviews that I could find, one with Andrea Canning from Dateline, and one from Allison Priest with The Record. In these interviews, Tony tried to explain away the evidence against him. It was a coincidence that he decided to wipe his computer hours after Rob's murder. It was a coincidence that Rob was found dead in the room where he first slept with Sophie. It was a coincidence that Tony was asking about a magazine for the same type of gun as the murder weapon. Tony said he was only asking his friend about guns because he lived in Texas and guns are cheaper there. His friend never got him the magazine, so how was this conversation even proof? As for being angry with Rob, Tony said he wasn't angry. He was just a little bit offended on Sophie's behalf that she had sex with this older man in a basement. Tony thought Rob should have at least taken her to a hotel. As for the talk of the mafia and the things he said that scared Sophie into thinking Rob was dangerous, Tony said he didn't remember saying any of that, and he also didn't remember showing her the gun shortly after finding out about the affair, but he admitted he did have it. He just said he gave it back to a friend. But Tony just said these things to the media. He had not taken the stand at his trial. And I said at the top of this episode that I didn't cover this case when I first wanted to because it was pending trial, and obviously this trial was over well before I even started Crimelines. It was actually pending retrial when I first wanted to cover it due to a successful appeal. There were two major issues at the trial that Tony won on appeal. One was that an investigator testified pretty frequently to his opinion of Tony's behavior during the police interview, saying that he didn't believe Tony was being truthful, he thought certain answers were evasive, and stuff like that. An issue the appellate court took with this was that he also talked on the stand about his experience working with the polygraph unit, and that may have given the jury the wrong idea about his ability to perceive when someone is being deceptive. They also noted that the police interview with Tony, like I said before, was only an audio recording. So the detective referred to things about how Tony shifted in his chair, things that the jury could not see and they could only rely on the detective's interpretation of. The other issue on the appeal was that the jury heard that Tony did not allow the consent search of his computer and that he asked for an attorney. It was referenced multiple times at the trial, and the jury heard it themselves on the recording of the interview. It is improper to use someone's refusal to consent to a search against them, just like you can't use the refusal to speak. Exercising your constitutional rights is not evidence of guilt. So 3 years after the trial in 2019, Tony Tung's conviction was overturned. The second trial was held in June of 2023, 12 years after Rob's murder. The family had been healing and moving forward in their lives, and this just brought them right back to the horrible time after Rob's death. The evidence that was used in the first trial that wasn't allowed in the second wasn't that substantial. It's not like they got the video footage of Tony leaving his apartment kicked out, or anything Sophie testified to, or even the friend he talked to about getting a magazine for a gun. It was just the detective couldn't give as many opinions about Tony's behavior, and the jury could not know that he didn't consent to searches. So while the state didn't lose that much evidence, they also didn't have any more evidence that would bolster the case. If anything, the passing of time made their evidence look a little weaker. The prosecutors mentioned Ring doorbells in an interview to Dateline, and that made me think about the effect affordable security cameras will have on our expectations of evidence. In the 2015 trial, they just had to worry about the CSI effect where everyone expects DNA or forensic evidence at trial. But in 2023, they had to worry about the security camera effect, where the juries will think that if Tony left his home that night and went to Teaneck, surely some camera would have caught it. But other than those things I just mentioned, the trial and the testimony was almost identical. When the jury took the case to deliberate, Rob's family left the courthouse. The first time it took 3.5 days to get a verdict, so they were prepared to wait. Instead, this verdict came back that same day, and the family didn't even make it back to the courthouse in time to hear it in person. Tony Tung was again found guilty, and once again he was sentenced to life in prison. When one of Rob's friends was asked by NBC News his thoughts on Tony Tung's appeal being granted, He said it made him question the justice system. He noted that we have innocent people stuck in prison for 10, 20, 30 years without any way of getting out. But Tony got an appeal granted in 3 years over a few lines of testimony when he's clearly guilty. And I think that's our lesson when it comes to the legal process in this case. It's not just innocent people who deserve fair trials. And if we want to protect the rights of the innocent, if we want to protect our rights, we have to apply these rights to the guilty as well. Thank you for listening. If you want more content, check out my other show, Crimelines and Consequences, wherever you get your podcasts. I also offer bonus content and ad-free listening at patreon.com/crimelines or through the Apple Podcast app. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crimelines, you can give a one-time donation at basementfourproductions.com/support.